one of the things that attracted me to this story is that it's a lot of the projects that Level in particular is working on are very absurd. So it's kind of naturally not a funny story because what they're doing is not really funny, but it's so absurd that it is kind of humorous, like what they're doing. For example, you might have heard of the concept of bat bombs during World War II.
This book you just wrote, I was really glad you reached out. This is coming out on Tuesday. Thank you for the copy, by the way.
Yeah, no problem.
But we have talked about, obviously, MK Ultra in passing on the podcast before. Some people have added a little more color when they know some more. But we've never really, like, dug all the way into it, kind of like the Tom O'Neill kind of treatment or something like that. So I'm very fascinated by that, and we'll get deep into that today. You also had another book called The Dirty Tricks Department. It's like you know me as far as like what I'm interested in. So this is about the OSS and World War II and secret warfare. I imagine that's a lot of John Dulles stuff.
Not so much John Dulles. That was about a group of scientists within the OSS. They were in charge of what's called the Research and Development Branch, who is in charge of making the secret weapons disguises, documents, forged documents, that kind of thing to equip secret agents. So it's the scientists who were doing all those, creating all those things.
How did you come across that story? That was your first book, but how did you even start to research that? What was the first thread?
That is a good question. The historian in me kind of looks back on the past and, even with these books thinks, how does anything really come together? As soon as you identify the cause of something, it's like, well, that was caused by something else that is just as integral. So when I look back on my own history, I think, well, I can tell the story of how I got interested in the Dirty Tricks Department. I was, reading, I think I might have been reading John Marx's The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, and he mentions Stanley Level in there, the main character of this book. And I think that's kind of how I learned about it. And since then, I guess he's been in the back of my mind. When I was in grad school, I was doing my dissertation on some scientists who had connections to the intelligence community. So
you did your dissertation on that?
Yeah, not on that book, but it was a separate topic related to that.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so I think I've always in the back of my head has been an interest in scientists in the intelligence community. And then I also had the knowledge of, there's this one guy, Stanley Level, who did some interesting things. And so somehow that kind of came together, and I thought, I'm going to write a book about this.
Who was Stanley Level?
He was a Boston chemist. And
that's a bad start, Boston chemist. Take your fucking chemistry set.
Yeah, and he got, during World War II, basically recruited to join the OSS. He was pretty close with this guy named Vannevar Bush. I don't know if you've heard of Vannevar Bush before.
Never.
He was kind of the unofficial science advisor to FDR during World War II. He's the guy who kind of told FDR really about the potential for an atomic bomb. People like to talk about this letter that Albert Einstein wrote to FDR saying, the Germans, that's not really what got the project started. What really got the project started is the British had this committee, the MOD committee, and they wrote a report about the potential of uranium to have some kind of nuclear chain reaction. And the important thing about the MOD report was saying that you don't need a ton of uranium to do this. It's possible to do this, with enough uranium that you could actually isolate U-235,
Wow.
And so Vannevar Bush got a hold of this MOD report and was pretty nervous about it. And so he's the one who approached FDR during World War II saying, we might need to do something about this. So that really got FDR to start this program.
And he was connected to Level how again?
Yeah, he was also from New England. And so they kind of knew each other. They were both scientists growing up in that milieu.
Got it.
So Vannevar Bush was also friends with William Donovan, who was the head of the OSS.
Yeah, Wild Bill. Yeah.
Wild Bill Donovan, exactly. And Donovan was looking for someone to lead the research and development branch to create the secret weapons and documents, disguises, that kind of thing. So Vannevar Bush suggested you should hire this guy, Stanley Level. So that's how Level got the job.
And so during the war, obviously in the middle of all this is what we all know, the Oppenheimer creation of the bomb. But there was all kinds of other stuff going on because you're dealing with Nazi Germany that was experimenting with biological weapons. They had an insane rocket program and stuff like that. So some of these scientists that you were looking into, whether it be Lavelle or some of the other ones, what were the other important things that we kind of miss in history that they were, involved in missions for related to science during the war?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that attracted me to this story is that it's a lot of the projects that Level in particular is working on are very absurd. So it's kind of naturally not a funny story because what they're doing is not really funny, but it's so absurd that it is kind of humorous, like what they're doing. For example, you might have heard of the concept of bat bombs during World War II. We're going to strap incendiary devices to bats and
Oh
release them
yeah.
over Japan. And, the idea behind this was that, well, instead of dropping incendiary bombs that, I mean, they're not targeted, they just land wherever they land. The wind can blow in one way or another.
Yeah.
Bats will roost in buildings. And so if we drop this over drop a bunch of bats who have napalm strapped to them over buildings, they're going to roost inside the buildings and we can time delay the napalm to explode. And so this will be like a targeted attack. We can directly hit their cities with this incendiary devices. That's the kind of thing Stanley Level was doing. That never actually went into the field, obviously. However, there were some field trials with it where Stanley Level, he got this guy named Louis Pfizer, who was a chemist at Harvard.
Pfizer.
Pfizer had invented napalm. So this is where napalm comes from.
Pfizer?
I don't know if it's the Pfizer that this is the company's named after.
That's
but,
a hell of a coincidence, but keep going.
But yeah, so Pfizer invented napalm while he was at Harvard. In fact, when he was inventing napalm, he would go to the Harvard soccer field and detonate his bombs. That was like just where he would practice doing this. But Level, of course, thought that was great, and he recruited Pfizer to join the R&D branch. And so he challenged Pfizer, I need you to invent a napalm device that's small enough we can attach to a bat. So he did that. Meanwhile, Level got some bat experts to capture some bats from Carlsbad Caverns and elsewhere and round them up. And, they did some tests on this. And during one of the tests, you had to cool down the bats so that they would kind of go into an artificial hibernation state so that you could put them in the planes and transport them. So they were doing this over a desert. They cooled down the bats, they put them in the plane, but they cooled them down too much, and when they dropped them, they just never woke up and they plummeted down into the desert. So that was how one test ended. Another test was, even more destructive. They were doing live tests with these bats. They attached one of these napalm bombs to it, and they had put it in this hibernative state, and they were taking some pictures of it, but it woke up too quickly, and it started flying off, and it actually flew into a barracks and into a control tower. Some other bats flew into a control tower. They detonated it and burned it all down. So it actually worked. The weapon did work, but we never used it. By the time that it was kind of finished, the atomic bomb was ready, and so there was really no need for it.
Ended things.
Yeah.
When you're looking at through the lens of something like that, where they're working on all these things during the biggest war in the history of the world, right? And there is nothing's ever perfect, but there is certainly an aspect of good versus evil there. You have two regimes that are just, you want to talk about like human rights abuses between the Nazi Germans and obviously in Japan, what was going on there. And it's like, these tricks we're doing almost seem like crazy and psychotic to a lot of people, but through the lens of studying it, do you ever like weigh the morality of what we're doing versus the loss of not doing that, if you understand what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point, because one of the main things I initially wanted to do in my first book, The Dirty Tricks Department, about Stanley Level, I actually wanted this to be a book about Stanley Level and Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of MKUltra, because what they were doing was really, really similar to each other.
And then your publisher said, that's 2 books.
Well, yeah. It wasn't my publisher who said that. I actually got the advice of some other professors at UT, kind of asking them, and they thought, this might make more sense as two, so I split it up. However, the similarities between them are kind of uncanny. During World War II, Stanley Level in the OSS is developing these secret weapons documents disguises. He's also doing truth drug experiments. So he's using mostly like marijuana. He's, getting soldiers this marijuana and
giving them weed to try to get
giving
the truth?
them weed to see if it'll lower their inhibitions and maybe he can get them to admit things. So there are these truth drug trials going on. He's also involved in plotting assassination attempts on foreign leaders. Okay, during World War II, how can we kill Hitler? What can we do to sneak a weapon in there somewhere and kill him? Or this is.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.